The term modernity and the modern era and that sort of thing are often thrown around, and a lot of people are very dismissive of it. And I can't really blame them to a certain extent. The argument being the modern era just is a way of describing wherever you are now. And it's kind of a term that's used to dismiss the past. It's a way of just saying, oh, we're modern now. In the past, they were savages. And I can get why people say that, because I mean, let's think about this. In the year 800, that was the modern era. In the year 0, that was the modern era. In the year 1950, that was what we would consider the modern era. So is there something meaningful about this term? And personally, I think there is. I think the world underwent such massive changes over the course of the 18th, 19th, and the first half of the 20th century that you can see it as like a complete paradigm shift that kind of the course of humanity completely altered. I mean, let's think about it for a minute. In the 20th century alone, we began the century barely getting off the ground with very primitive airplanes, and 70 years later, we were going to the moon. 300 years ago, very few countries had constitutions. Now, virtually every country has a constitution. Concepts like human rights emerged, the international community, things like the UN, the importance of political ideology really became important. I mean, some of these things had existed beforehand, but we did see a very civilization on a global scale take a very different direction in the last 300 years. Very few countries resemble what they were 300 years ago. Many of them have changed their names, borders have radically changed, culture, forms of government, economies. Virtually everything is different now than it had been in the past. So, the point of this series is we're going to look at the forces that gave birth to the modern era. We're going to look at them and see where they came from, how they impacted and kind of led to the end of the traditional world, and what kind of methods and what kind of approaches various societies took to try to deal with this transition to modernity. Specifically, we're going to take a look at societies like France, Germany, Japan, Italy, Persia, that sort of thing. What were the differences with how these various traditional societies tried to deal with modernity? Because there's a lot of different approaches that were taken. Russia, for instance, just said no, we aren't going to modernize at all. We're not even going to have a basic constitution. France took to a certain extent that perspective and then reversed course, and the French reversed course a lot. Spain also initially took refusal to change, but then they became liberal, then they became reactionary again. And then you had countries like Germany and Japan who tried to make a syncretic philosophy. They tried to take aspects of monarchism and state religion and mix it with some modern ideas and not be fully democratic, I guess, in the way we would understand it today. And kind of try to make this syncretic system, and that was kind of another way of dealing with it. And interestingly enough, well, some of these certainly succeeded better than others. A lot of them kind of became victims of their own success. As we'll get into, Germany and Japan in particular industrialized rapidly and became military powerhouses, but the nature of the system they built was extremely militaristic and aggressive, and it kind of led to the system's destruction. And that's what happened with a lot of fascist governments, is in a lot of ways they were able to kind of resolve some of the issues that the Qing and the other kind of traditional societies faced and the issues modern societies face, but their excessively aggressive warmongering is what ultimately sunk them. External threats sunk them instead of internal threats. Whether nationalism is an invention of the Enlightenment or it represents an omnipresent force throughout human history really depends upon how you define the term. Because you could make a case that nationalism as it's generally used today is a idea that emerged during the Enlightenment that de-emphasized religious or spiritual justifications for the upper class to rule and instead replaced it with an identitarian focus. That is, the king didn't rule because God had designated him to rule. He ruled because the people wanted him to rule, and his purpose was to serve the German people or serve the Italian people, not specifically to serve God in the way it used to be. A good example of this was how Proto-German nationalism was one of the big causes of the Reformation. That is, the corruption of the church in Rome and the resentment among Germans that the form of Christianity that they were subscribing to was entirely Italian in nature and was run by Italians, and that they weren't looking out for the interests of the German people. Also, the idea that all peoples of a certain group had to be together in one state is to a certain extent a product of the 18th and 19th century. That being said, though, if you want to use the term more generally to refer to the tendency of people to have a collective identity that's based upon some sort of shared identity, be it religious, cultural, racial, linguistic, then that goes back as far as history does. I think it's a little anachronistic, but you can definitely say that Rome, for instance, had a very strong sense of nationalism, although it was in many ways civic nationalism. Like during the war against Hannibal savaged Italy for over a decade. The Romans lost 3 full field armies in a very short period of time. Despite all of this, though, there was no serious talk of surrender or a negotiated peace with Carthage. The vast majority of Romans were willing to fight to the death for Rome, to preserve the Roman way of life and to preserve the Roman culture and the Roman state. And ultimately, in contrast to the Carthaginians, who were primarily concerned with money, it proved to be a more powerful system. The Romans actually banned the word peace from being spoken in public, and their endurance and their dedication meant that no matter how many victories Hannibal won, no matter how much of the countryside he burned, the Romans were willing to stay in and fight as long as it took, which I guess you could say kind of echoes what would eventually happen with Germany and Russia. So that was 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, actually. And that is, I think, a very, once again, the term may be a little anachronistic, but I don't think you can really doubt that that's similar to the modern concept of nationalism. Also within Japan and China and a lot of Asian countries, they often have a term for people who aren't from their particular country, be it gaijin or foreign devil. The Chinese had this concept of the Middle Kingdom, that they were the center of the world or the center of the universe, and that all foreign peoples were barbarians. And this is very common. You may not necessarily have the modern ideal of the nation state, but you definitely had a concept of these other people aren't like us. They worship strange gods. They have their family structure is different. They have different aesthetic tastes. They look different. And that is something that has always existed and has existed as long as humanity has existed and will exist as long as humanity continues to exist. So if you're going to talk about it in that way, the idea of a group of people who have a shared identity, the nationalism is not a new thing at all. But as a source of legitimacy, as kind of the primary source of legitimacy for the state, and the desire to have all peoples of the one group united within one country, is to a certain extent a product of the modern era. Also, the scale of it has gotten much larger. Because in the past, maybe your identity was your village or your province or your region of the country. And you didn't necessarily, even if it was a country in the sense like France, the Kingdom of France, you didn't necessarily identify with other people from different parts. Like you might be from Aquitaine or Gascony or Normandy and you speak a completely different dialect to the point you can't really understand each other. So while you're both French and you're both a lot similar than you would be to, say, the English, there might not be that sense of collective identity. Also, a lot of people just didn't leave the villages where they were born in. Most of the population was illiterate. They didn't really know much about the outside world. So my view of to how modern nationalism developed was a result of technological, economic, and social change. Once you started to get more modern forms of communication, like once newspapers started to become common, more and more of the population could read, the colonies were established, people started to have a lot more contact with the external world, be it just the next door country or the other side of the world. I think people started to see that their differences were kind of petty compared to other people's. Like the people in Castile and the people in Catalan may be different in a lot of ways, but compared to the Aztecs or the Maya or the Chinese, they were much, much more similar. And I think to a certain extent, what happens is the more different the people you come up against, the more petty kind of the individual differences seem, and the more likely you are to form a broader collective identity. And we saw this a lot in Europe during the Crusades and during the Ottoman assault, where the various Christian states would put aside their kind of smaller differences in favor of a collective identification with their faith. And we can kind of see this nowadays with pan Europeanism or European identitarianism, where people are identifying with the continent as a whole, even though the people in the next country over don't necessarily speak the same language or have the same culture. They're much more similar to one another than they are to the rise of the Islamic world or the emergence of Africa or China kind of ending its period of isolation. And you see that in something Reagan said, where the only thing that would unite the world is an alien invasion. Because at that point, we'd identify as human instead of identifying with our civilization or our particular country. So I think to a certain extent, like I said, once people started to get a broader look at the world, that began to form. Now, there were some other reasons for it to emerge. For example, I think the modern technology and a modern economy require a lot more central planning and a lot more direct government control of the country to build things like highways and railways and to regulate banks and to regulate the stock market and to engage in international trade. I think all of these things prompted a stronger central government. Also, probably the biggest factor in a country as to whether it's centralized or decentralized is how easy communication is and how easy it is to control kind of the commanding heights of the country. Like in China, how it tended to work was the Chinese government would control the salt mines and they'd have a salt monopoly. And because salt is necessary for life, they only had to control those particular provinces and they could kind of impose their will on the rest. One of the most centralized societies in early history was Egypt, because all you had to do is control the Nile and you controlled the entirety of the country. So Egypt was extremely centralized. A lot of Mesopotamian city states were very centralized because they were small in size, and it was very easy for the ruler to impose direct rule. Once you start to get into an era where you have more and more advanced forms of communication, it's much easier to centralize power. Now, the other big thing that I think really led to the rise of nationalism was the changing nature of warfare. Because traditionally, you needed a warrior aristocracy. If you look at knights during the medieval era, if they were in full plate, they were just about invincible. All people could really do is try to hurt them with a mace or dogpile them and try to slip a dagger into their visor. It's almost impossible to get through full plate conventionally. And that combined with lances and stirrups and heavy war horses that often also wore armor made European knights almost unbeatable. Plate mail would even defeat early firearms. So there was very little people could do against them except die. If you look at a lot of the battles that forces like the Normans or the Crusaders went up against Islamic armies, it would be they'd beat armies 10 times their size handily because of how much better they were. And that really changed once you got into the modern era and you developed good firearms. Because you could train a guy to load and shoot a musket in a couple weeks. If you went for a couple months, they might actually become a good shot. And that guy who had only had a couple weeks of training could easily defeat a knight. He just had to point and shoot him. And because of that, the idea of quality just fell off the bridge. There's no real advantage to it anymore because guns brought a certain sense of equality. So the focus then became you had to get a large army. You had to get as large an army as possible and get your men in a line and just fire with muskets. So the question is, how do you carry this out? How do you get the massive number of people necessary to be able to have an army large enough to really take advantage of that? And the answer was nationalism. And that's, to me, the reason why France did so well in the Napoleonic Wars, is nationalism allowed the recruitment of large armies of middle and lower class people and gave them something to fight for. And they were willing to fight and die for France or fight and die for Germany or fight and die for Britain when they might not have been willing to fight and die for the king. So Napoleon and the French republics were able to use this to raise armies larger than the rest of Europe combined. Whereas a lot of those countries were still kind of reliant on, if not semi feudal, then kind of a warrior aristocracy that just was very old view of warfare that was just completely anachronistic. And almost overnight made a lot of the aristocracy throughout Europe obsolete because they weren't needed to provide soldiers anymore. Particularly, they weren't needed to provide highly trained knights and men at arms. So let's start to look at some examples of how this played out. I've already mentioned France, in which the French Republic and Napoleon were able to successfully leverage emerging French nationalism to recruit huge numbers of soldiers. The Levy en masse, it was called. And through that, they were able, like I said, to outnumber the combined armies of the rest of Europe, be it the Italian cities, the Germans, the British, the Spanish, even the Russians. They were able to match or outnumber them through that recruitment. And like I said, the soldiers were willing to fight and die for the country. It's kind of interesting when you look at the warlord era in China. One of the things that really scared the warlords about the communists was that their soldiers wouldn't desert at the first sign of trouble, which is kind of a reoccurring theme throughout Chinese history, and that absolutely terrified them because their own soldiers would abandon them at the first opportunity. To a large extent, I think you can argue that Japanese nationalism was one of the driving forces for the modernization of the country, because Japan wanted to become great. They wanted to become a great power. They didn't want to become like China, which had just been repeatedly humiliated by foreign powers. If they were going to preserve Japaneseness, if they were going to preserve the Japanese people, they were going to have to become as strong as the European powers, so they would be the ones making the demands. And some people are critical of Emperor Meiji and kind of the efforts to reform Japan and make it into a modern country, but I would argue because they were willing to embrace that, they were able to maintain their independence and maintain Japanese culture in a way that a lot of societies that were colonized didn't. And they were even able to successfully maintain a lot of aspects of their traditional form of government in kind of an updated form. So traditionally how it worked in Japan is you had the daimyo, and they controlled land equivalent to a certain amount of koku. A koku is, roughly speaking, the amount of rice it takes to feed a man for a year. So your fief would be like 10,000 koku or like 500 koku or something like that. And it wasn't quite the same as Europe, because in Europe you would have a piece of land that was owned by your family, or rather administered by your family, for all time. Whereas in Japan, it changed all the time to reflect local crop yields, whether you got promoted or demoted. True in a lot of parts of the country, particularly Western Japan, it was basically just a hereditary fief. But when the shogunate fell and you had the Meiji Restoration, what wound up happening is the emperor revoked the domains and they became the purview of the central government. But the various daimyo were given huge cash settlements, sometimes in the form of money, sometimes in the form of government bonds. They were also all appointed to the House of Peers, so they maintained a lot of their political power and their monetary power. So what they were mostly able to do was they made the transition to becoming the founders of the Zaibetsu, and so you had basically a continuation of the Japanese aristocracy running the country. Just instead of holding fiefs, they controlled the large corporations and they controlled power in a more parliamentary fashion. And something similar happened in Germany. From my understanding, what Prussia wound up doing with land reform is they revoked 2/3 of all the nobility's lands. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind when we talk about something like this is there's a bit of a difference between holding land as a fief and having it as your private property. Because one is, there's certain responsibilities that you have to the central government and to the people under your rule, and it's given to you in trust. So what the German government did, or the Prussian government, is they revoked 2/3 of the land and they gave the Junkers the rest of it. And the Junkers were also able to participate in the House of Lords and once again in the new large corporations that formed. Although he was a hardcore liberal, Simon Bolivar actually believed in a mixed form of government. He thought there should be an elective Congress a hereditary Senate and a president for life. So he kind of thought there would be these three different elected or different chosen branches of the country that would kind of counterbalance each other. And that's also what you had in Germany, where you had a House of Lords or a House of Nobility, then you had an elected Diet, and then you had the monarch who still retained significant powers, which is also what you had in Japan. And those were with both French empires being somewhat similar. Now, one of the things I suppose you could say is nationalism to a certain extent led to a form of egalitarianism. Because the idea was we're all Germans, we're all Japanese, we're all brothers, we should have a right to certain basic guarantees because we're German or because we're Russian, etc. So that did, I think, lead to a lot of constitutionalism, but I think it's also due to the emergence of a middle class who had money but didn't have political power, and the nobility no longer really serving a purpose because they were no longer needed for military service, nor were they necessarily needed as an educated elite who was capable of running the government offices, because you also had a lot of middle class people who were in many ways were better educated and who didn't have the same respect, once again, the same kind of divine right that they used to have. A state's source of legitimacy had changed. No longer was it that France was France because the French monarchy ruled it, or the Holy Roman Empire was the Holy Roman Empire because the emperor ruled it. Now France was France because it's where the French people lived. England is England because it's where the English people lived. Russia isn't Russia because it's a patrimonial society where the Tsar personally owns the country. Russia is Russia because it's the homeland of the Russian people. And the legitimacy of the Russian state stemmed from that, and not from the Tsar and not from divine right anymore. As for the multi ethnic Austro Hungarian Empire, there's a lot of debate as to what ultimately would have happened if World War I hadn't collapsed it. If they would have been able to make it a triple monarchy and add in the South Slavs and properly have kind of a loose confederation of the different peoples, if it would have collapsed from the local forms of nationalism, or what ultimately would have happened is up for debate. That being said, when it finally did collapse, the scramble over the scraps of the Austro-Hungarian Empire would last into the 90s and beyond. We're still dealing with that fallout, and they still haven't managed to make, in many cases, viable nation states out of the Habsburg Empire's ashes. The best example of this change from divine right or monarchical legitimacy to national legitimacy, and to the idea that, once again, the nation state, its legitimacy derives from the fact that it's a homeland of a particular people, can be seen in the fall of the Qing dynasty in China. So it's a little confusing when you talk about ethnicity in China, because as with like France or Germany or the United States, there's a lot of different local peoples and different local cultures, and there's often a lot of variance between them. But over time, this idea emerged that pretty much all the people in the South who weren't Muslim were something called Han Chinese. To this day, China is 95% Han Chinese, with the remainder being Muslim, Manchu, or Mongolian, or just a couple other random groups. So the demographics were fairly similar back then. It was about 90 to 95% Han Chinese, with the remainder being Manchu and the various other nomadic peoples. So after the Ming Dynasty had fallen several centuries previously, the Manchu people had come down from northeastern China and had conquered it and set up the Qing Dynasty. One would expect the Qing to have attempted to Sinify themselves, to breed with the local Chinese nobility, to adopt Chinese dress, Chinese customs, etc. But in a lot of cases, that really wasn't the case. The court language remained Manchu. The Manchus generally only married other Manchus, and the highest officials in the country were only composed of Manchus. In fact, it was a great scandal during the Taiping Rebellion when they started to appoint Han generals for the first time. There was also a lot of other aspects to the rule, particularly the queue, which there's some debate as to whether the Han just adopted this on their own as a sign of loyalty or if it was forced upon them. Frankly, given how ugly the hairstyle is, I like to think it was enforced upon them as a form of humiliation. But yeah, the Han Chinese wore the Q, which is basically you shave most of your head and then you have one long braid down the back. It is absolutely hideous. Actually, it's funny because during the Taiping Rebellion, people would either shave their queue off or they'd grow their hair long, or they just how they wore their hair would determine what side of the Civil War they were on. And when one side took over a city, like when the Taipings took over, they would kill everyone who was wearing a queue. So the Qing dynasty, and we'll talk about this more later when we talk about autocracy and kind of the failure of the ruling class, but it had been decaying rapidly. The emperor lived a very isolated existence at the court. The world had kind of passed China by, and it was getting repeatedly humiliated by defeat after defeat, and they were called the unequal treaties. And China was having to cede like parts of the country to foreign powers to set up legations. So, as all this was going on, the Chinese increasingly blamed the Manchus. And they said, China is being ruled by this foreign occupier, and they aren't running the country properly. They don't have the mandate of heaven. They don't have the divine right to rule. What we need is a government by the Chinese for the Chinese. And so this this was one of the main causes of the Taiping Rebellion, where the leader of the Taipings, Hong, was a Han Chinese. Specifically, his subgroup was Hakka, but it's a type of Han Chinese. They wanted to expel who they saw as the foreign invaders and restore China for the Chinese people. And it's interesting because how the state had been structured is there was two armies within Imperial China. There was the Green Standard and the Green Banner Army. The Green Standard Army was made up of Han Chinese, and it was utterly incompetent, corrupt, and tended to run away whenever it was faced with actual combat. And the Green Banner Army was composed of various nomadic peoples, Manchu, Mongolians, Turks, just the various frontier peoples of China. And they were kind of like a feudal levy. They were cavalry who I believe had a land grant or something to that effect, and in return they trained and they were fairly skilled warriors. Now the issue is, and we talked about this earlier, by the time of the Taiping Rebellion, we're in the mid 19th century. Guns are very widespread, even in China, and the Taipings were very skilled at smuggling them in. So the Green Standard Army largely just either ran away or defected to the Taipings because they hated the Qing. The Green Banner Army just got slaughtered because they were cavalry who were largely using sabers or lances and stuff, and they were coming up against modern muskets. So they got slaughtered, and you basically had a period where the Qing Empire collapsed. The Qing government ceased to really have any effective authority outside of Beijing. The only thing that saved them, and we're getting a little off topic, was once the Taipings took Nanking, they discovered how much fun polygamy was, and they spent their days in their pleasure palaces, and that kind of was one of the things that made them lose strategic initiative. Anyways, so what wound up happening during this time period is local scholar bureaucrats, or the local mandarins. Traditionally in China, mandarins weren't allowed to be employed within their home province. The idea being you send them around the country, they don't have a local power base. But what wound up happening was various mandarins went to their home provinces, and there they raised armies that were personally loyal to them. They were made up of people of the same sub-ethnicity, they spoke the same language, they had the same culture, and their focus was to defend their province, to defend their people, to defend their home from a foreign invader. And this worked exceedingly well. That, and they decided to actually pay their soldiers on time, which it turns out really helps out with morale. So while the local armies were eventually able to put down the Taipings, the Qing never really recovered from it, and China would eventually degenerate into a series of warlords who would control various aspects of the country, and the Qing dynasty was finally itself overthrown. Nationalism, in particular the idea that all one people should be within one state, made traditional society as it was untenable. The old borders had to be withdrawn. The source of legitimacy that governments had to be completely changed around. There was a certain sense of equality and egalitarianism that came from this idea of the nation being a family or the nation being a brotherhood. Thus, the rise of nationalism and the nation state is one of the causes